Nobody knew what he would do until he saw his brother's body. Samuel Carter had spoken maybe 50 words in the past 5 years. 50 words to a town of 300 souls. But on that cold November morning, when he found Jake's lifeless form sprawled behind Murphy's saloon, something cracked inside the quietest man in Cedar Valley. Not his voice, that remained locked away like always, but something deeper. Something that had been waiting in the silence, patient as death itself. The townspeople would later say they saw it in his eyes. That moment when Sam knelt beside his younger brother, when he touched the dried blood on Jake's temple, when he noticed the playing cards scattered around the body like fallen leaves. They said his blue eyes turned darker than a winter storm, colder than the mountain peaks that watched over their forgotten town. But here's what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known as they gathered around whispering their theories and suspicions. Samuel Carter had been keeping quiet for a reason. Not because he was shy or simple, like some believed. Not because he had nothing to say. He stayed quiet because he saw everything, heard everything, remembered everything. And in a town built on secrets, silence was the deadliest weapon a man could carry. That morning, holding his brother's cold hand, Sam made a promise without speaking a word. Justice would come to Cedar Valley. Not the kind that rode in with badges and warrants, but the kind that moved like shadows, patient and inevitable. The kind that remembered every whispered conversation, every guilty glance, every lie told on a Sunday morning. The quietest cowboy in town was about to teach them all the power of silence. Cedar Valley sat in God's forgotten country, nestled between Red Canyon walls like a secret whispered to the wind. The town had grown around a natural spring that bubbled up from the desert floor, bringing life to a place that should have been nothing but dust and tumbleweeds. Main Street stretched exactly 4 blocks, lined with weathered buildings that leaned against each other like old friends sharing stories. Murphy's saloon anchored the western end, its batwing doors creaking a lonesome song every time the desert breeze picked up. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, mixing with the distant lowing of cattle and the rhythmic hammering from Peterson's blacksmith shop. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson's general store displayed its wares behind windows so dusty they filtered the harsh sunlight into something soft and golden. The church stood at the other end of town, its white paint peeling like old skin, its bell tower reaching toward heaven with desperate fingers. Between the saloon and the church lay the heart of Cedar Valley, ordinary folks trying to make extraordinary lives in an unforgiving land. Samuel Carter lived on the edge of it all, in a small ranch house he'd built with his own hands after their father died. He was 32 years old, tall and lean as a fence post, with calloused hands that spoke of honest work and shoulders broad enough to carry whatever burden the world threw at him. His dark hair had started showing silver at the temples, though nobody could say if it was from age or worry. People in town knew Sam by his silence more than his words. He'd nod when spoken to, tip his hat to the ladies, pay his bills on time, and buy supplies without ever asking for credit. He worked cattle for the big ranchers when they needed extra hands, fixed broken things around town when folks asked, and never caused trouble for anybody. His younger brother Jake was the opposite, 26 years old and full of life, laughter, and stories. Where Sam was quiet, Jake was loud. Where Sam was careful, Jake was reckless. Jake spent his evenings in Murphy's saloon, playing cards and telling tales, buying drinks for strangers and charming the local girls with his easy smile. The brothers lived together but walked different paths. Sam would rise before dawn to tend their small herd of cattle, while Jake would stumble home just as the sun was painting the canyon walls pink. Sam saved every penny. Jake spent money like water in the desert. Sam wore the same clothes until they fell apart. Jake bought fancy boots and silver belt buckles. But they were blood, and in a hard country, blood meant everything. The town had its share of characters, each carrying their own secrets like rocks in their pockets. There was Mayor Davidson, a soft man with soft hands who'd never worked a day outside his father's bank. Deputy Marshal Collins, who wore his badge more for show than duty, since Sheriff Morrison only visited Cedar Valley once a month. Mrs. Chin, who ran the boarding house and knew everyone's business but kept it locked behind her knowing smile. And then there was Marcus Webb, who owned the biggest ranch in the valley and half the buildings in town. Webb was the kind of man who smiled with his mouth but not his eyes, who shook hands while counting your fingers afterward. He had money, influence, and the kind of charm that made people forget to ask hard questions. The routine of Cedar Valley was as predictable as the sunrise. Folks woke with the roosters, worked until the sun burned their backs, and gathered at Murphy's when the day's heat finally broke. They gossiped about weather and cattle prices, worried about Apache raids that never came, and dreamed of better days that might never arrive. It was a quiet life in a quiet town, where the loudest sounds were usually the wind through the canyons and the Saturday night piano at Murphy's. A place where a man could disappear into his own silence and nobody would think twice about it. But quiet places have a way of keeping secrets, and secrets have a way of demanding payment. The payment was about to come due. The relationship between Sam and Jake Carter was complicated, like trying to read a book with half the pages missing. They shared the same blood, the same stubborn streak, the same way of squinting when they were thinking hard about something. But they'd grown up to be different men, shaped by the same harsh country into entirely different shapes. Their father, Thomas Carter, had been a preacher-turned-rancher who believed in hard work, harder prayer, and the hardest truth of all, that a man was measured by what he built, not what he said. When he died of fever 5 years ago, he left behind a small ranch, a smaller herd, and 2 sons who loved each other but couldn't understand each other. Sam had inherited his father's sense of responsibility. He felt the weight of every debt, every obligation, every promise made and yet to be kept. The ranch wasn't much, just enough land to graze 30 head of cattle and grow a small garden, but it was theirs, free and clear. Sam worked from sunup to sundown to keep it that way, mending fences, digging wells, and hiring himself out to bigger ranches when money got tight. Jake had inherited their father's charm but none of his discipline. He could talk a snake out of its skin, make friends with anyone, and find the silver lining in the darkest cloud. But he couldn't stick to anything long enough to see it through. He'd start a job with enthusiasm, work hard for a week or 2, then drift away when something more interesting caught his eye. The town saw them as the quiet brother and the wild brother, but it wasn't that simple. Sam's silence came from years of watching and listening, of learning that most problems solved themselves if you waited long enough and most words were wasted breath. Jake's chatter came from a restless spirit that couldn't bear silence, couldn't stand being alone with his own thoughts. Still, they were brothers. When Jake lost his job at the feed store for showing up drunk 3 days in a row, Sam covered his debts without a word of complaint. When Sam caught pneumonia 2 winters back, Jake nursed him through it, sleeping in a chair beside his bed and forcing soup down his throat every few hours. But lately, something had changed. Jake had been different for the past few months, quieter than usual, more serious, jumping at unexpected sounds. He'd started carrying his father's old Colt revolver, claiming he'd seen Apache sign near the north pasture. When Sam pressed him about it with raised eyebrows and questioning looks, Jake would just shrug and change the subject. The truth was, Jake had gotten himself into trouble. Again. It started with a poker game at Murphy's saloon 3 months ago. Marcus Webb had been in town on business, and he'd joined the regular evening game. Webb was known as a careful player. He rarely bluffed, never bet more than he could afford to lose, and somehow always managed to walk away ahead. But that night was different. Webb was drinking more than usual, talking louder, playing hands he never would have played sober. Jake saw an opportunity. He'd been losing steadily for weeks, and Sam had been giving him those disappointed looks that hurt worse than any lecture. Here was a chance to win back everything and more. So when Webb raised the pot to $200, more money than Jake had ever seen in one place, Jake called the bet with money he didn't have. He lost. Badly. Not just the hand, but 3 more after it, chasing his losses like a man trying to catch his own shadow. By the end of the night, Jake owed Marcus Webb $800. In Cedar Valley, where most men were lucky to see $50 cash money in a year, $800 might as well have been $8,000. Webb had been patient at first. He gave Jake time to pay, even offered him work on his ranch to help settle the debt. But Jake's pride wouldn't let him become Webb's hired hand, especially not with the whole town knowing why. He took odd jobs instead, saved every penny, but $800 stayed as far away as the moon. The town started talking. In a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, Jake's debt became common knowledge. Some folks felt sorry for him. Everyone knew what it was like to make bad choices. Others were less sympathetic. Jake had been living high and mighty while his brother worked like a mule, they said. Maybe it was time he learned what real work felt like. But Sam knew his brother better than the town did. He saw how Jake's hands shook when he thought nobody was looking. He noticed how Jake started walking different routes around town, avoiding certain people, staying away from Murphy's except when absolutely necessary. Most telling of all, Jake had stopped talking about the future, stopped making plans, stopped believing in silver linings. Sam had his own savings, money set aside for emergencies, for drought years, for the day when age would catch up with him and he'd need something more than strong hands and a stubborn will. He could have paid Jake's debt easily. But Jake had never asked, and Sam's pride ran as deep as his brother's. Besides, Sam had been watching Marcus Webb for years. He'd seen how Webb operated, how he smiled while he squeezed, how he used other people's weaknesses against them. There was something about this whole situation that didn't sit right, like a fence post that looked solid but was rotting from the inside. Something was wrong in Cedar Valley, and Jake's gambling debt was just the beginning. The night Jake died, Sam had been lying awake listening to the wind howl through the canyon like lost souls searching for rest. It was the kind of night that made honest men check their locks and pray for morning, when the darkness felt thick enough to touch and the silence between wind gusts pressed against your ears like a living thing. Jake hadn't come home. That wasn't unusual. He'd been staying out later and later, sometimes not returning until dawn. But something felt different this time. Maybe it was the way Jake had looked at dinner, pushing food around his plate without eating, glancing toward the door every few minutes like he was expecting trouble to walk right through it. Or maybe it was the way he'd said goodnight. Not with his usual grin and casual wave, but with a long look that seemed to take in everything: the small kitchen they'd eaten 1,000 meals in, the wooden table their father had built with his own hands, Sam himself sitting there mending a bridle by lamplight. "Sam," Jake had said, his voice quieter than usual. You know I never meant for things to get so complicated." Sam had looked up from his work, meeting his brother's eyes. For a moment, he'd almost spoken, almost asked what was wrong, what kind of trouble Jake had gotten himself into this time. But the words had stayed locked inside, same as always, and he'd just nodded. Jake had nodded back, touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that seemed more like a salute than a goodbye, and walked out into the night. That had been 8 hours ago. When the sun finally rose, painting the sky the color of dried blood, Sam went looking. He started at Murphy's saloon, where the owner told him Jake had been there early in the evening, nursing a single whiskey and talking to nobody. He'd left around 10 o'clock, walking east toward the church. Sam followed that path, his boots echoing off the empty buildings. Cedar Valley looked different in the early morning light, smaller somehow, more fragile, like a town made of paper that might blow away in the next strong wind. He found Jake behind Murphy's saloon, in the narrow alley where folks sometimes went to settle disputes away from prying eyes. Jake was lying on his back, arms spread wide, staring up at the strip of sky visible between the building tops. His hat lay a few feet away, and scattered around his body were playing cards, 5 cards that told a story Sam couldn't yet read. The Ace of Spades. the King of Hearts, the Queen of Diamonds, the Jack of Clubs, and the Ten of Hearts. A straight flush. The kind of hand that came along once in a lifetime, the kind of hand worth betting everything on. Sam knelt beside his brother, feeling for a pulse he knew wouldn't be there. Jake's skin was cold, his eyes fixed on something beyond the sky. There was blood on his temple, dried dark in the morning air, and his right hand was closed around something small and hard. When Sam pried open his brother's fingers, he found a silver poker chip. Not the kind they used at Murphy's, this one was fancy, with intricate designs etched around the edges and initials carved in the center, M.W. Marcus Webb. Sam sat back on his heels, looking at the chip, the cards, his brother's peaceful face. Jake looked younger in death, the worry lines smoothed away, the tension finally gone from his shoulders. He looked like the kid who used to follow Sam around the ranch, asking 100 questions and believing every tall tale their father told. The sound of voices pulled Sam back to the present. Townspeople were gathering at the mouth of the alley, drawn by some sixth sense that told them tragedy had come calling. Mrs. Henderson covered her mouth with both hands. Deputy Marshal Collins pushed through the crowd, his face pale, his hand resting uncertainly on his gun. "Sam," Collins said, his voice shaky. "Sam, what happened here?" Sam looked up at him, still holding the silver chip. For a moment, words pressed against his lips, explanations, accusations, demands for justice. But they stayed locked inside, same as always. He stood up slowly, pocketed the chip, and walked away without saying a word. But his silence had changed. Before, it had been the silence of a man who chose not to speak. Now it was the silence of a man who was listening, watching, remembering everything. The hunt had begun. Sam's investigation began with what he did best, watching and waiting. For 3 days after Jake's funeral, he maintained his regular routine, tending cattle, mending fences, working odd jobs around town. But now his silence had purpose, his stillness had direction. He was a hawk circling high above the valley, seeing everything while appearing to see nothing at all. The town's reaction to Jake's death told its own story. Most folks were genuinely saddened. Jake had been well-liked despite his flaws, the kind of man who could make you smile even when you were mad at him. They brought food to Sam, offered condolences, shared memories of Jake's jokes and kindness. But some reactions struck Sam as wrong, like musical notes played just slightly off-key. Marcus Webb had attended the funeral, standing in the back of the church with his hat in his hands and sorrow written across his face. He'd approached Sam afterward, clasping his shoulder with what seemed like genuine sympathy. "Jake was a good man," Webb had said. "Made some poor choices, but who among us hasn't? If there's anything you need, anything at all, you just say the word." Sam had nodded his thanks, but something about Webb's grip lingered too long, and his eyes didn't quite match his words. It was the look of a man who was trying too hard to appear innocent. Deputy Marshal Collins had ruled Jake's death accidental, a fall during a drunken walk, the kind of tragedy that befell young men who mixed whiskey with poor judgment. The playing cards were just coincidence, he said. Maybe Jake had been practicing card tricks, or maybe someone had dropped them earlier and the wind had blown them around. But Sam remembered his father's lessons about reading sign. A good tracker didn't just see what was there, he saw what was missing, what didn't belong, what told a story different from the obvious one. The cards weren't random. They'd been placed deliberately, arranged in a pattern that meant something to someone. And Jake's body position was wrong for a simple fall, too neat, too composed, like he'd been laid out rather than dropped. Sam's first real lead came from an unexpected source, Mrs. Chin at the boarding house. 3 days after the funeral, Sam was replacing a broken step on her front porch when she emerged with a cup of coffee and a troubled expression. "Your brother," she said without preamble, settling into a rocking chair. He came to see me 2 weeks ago. Sam looked up from his work, hammer suspended in mid-swing. Asked about renting a room, she continued. Said he might need a place to stay for a while. Seemed nervous, kept looking over his shoulder. I told him my rooms were full, but truth is, I was worried about getting mixed up in whatever trouble he was carrying. She sipped her coffee, watching Sam's face. He left me something. Said if anything happened to him, I should give it to you. I've been carrying it around ever since, not knowing whether I should or shouldn't. From her apron pocket, she produced a folded piece of paper, yellow with age and handled often. Sam set down his hammer and took it, recognizing immediately the careful script of their father's handwriting. It was a deed not to their small ranch, but to a section of land north of town that Sam had never known they owned. According to the document, their father had won the land in a poker game 20 years ago, before Sam was born. It was apparently good grazing land with a natural spring, worth considerably more than their current spread. But there was something else tucked inside the deed, a recent survey map showing the same land, with notes in Jake's handwriting. The spring on their property connected to a larger underground water source that ran beneath half of Cedar Valley, including Marcus Webb's biggest ranch. Control the water, control the valley. It was an old truth in desert country. That evening, Sam rode out to the land described in the deed. It took him 2 hours to find it, following landmarks their father had noted on the map. What he found was indeed good land, rolling hills covered in rich grass, protected from the worst of the desert winds by natural rock formations. But more importantly, he found evidence that someone else had been using the land. Cattle had grazed here recently, enough to crop the grass short and leave the distinctive signs of a large herd. There were campfire remnants, areas where temporary corrals had been erected, and the tracks of multiple horses and riders. Someone had been running cattle on Carter land without permission, and Sam had a good idea who. The next day, he paid a visit to old Pete Garrison, who'd worked as a cowhand for every major ranch in the valley over the past 30 years. Pete lived alone in a one-room shack on the edge of town, making ends meet by taking in horses to shoe and mend. He was also the closest thing Cedar Valley had to a walking history book. Sam found Pete working in his small corral, breaking a young horse to saddle. The old man looked up as Sam approached, reading something in his expression that made him set aside his work. "Heard about Jake," Pete said simply. "Sorry for your loss." Sam nodded, then pulled out the deed and survey map. Pete examined them carefully, squinting in the afternoon light. "Well, I'll be damned," Pete muttered. "So old Thomas did win this land off of Cherokee Bill. Heard rumors about that game for years, but never knew if they were true." He handed the papers back to Sam. "You asking because someone's been using your land?" Sam nodded. "Figured as much. Been seeing extra cattle moving through here for months now. Always wondered where they were going." Pete's eyes narrowed. "You thinking Marcus Webb's been grazing his herd on your property?" Another nod. "That'd be like him. Man's got more land than he knows what to do with, but he always wants more. And if he's been using that water source..." Pete whistled low. "That's worth more than all the cattle in the valley." Sam mounted his horse, preparing to leave, but Pete called after him. "Sam, whatever you're planning, be careful. Webb's got friends in high places, and he doesn't like losing what he considers his. Your brother found that out the hard way." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, and Sam rode home with the weight of understanding settling on his shoulders like snow. Jake hadn't died because of a gambling debt. He'd died because he'd stumbled onto something much bigger, a theft that had been going on for years, involving land, water rights, and enough money to kill for. Now Sam knew what he was hunting. The question was, what was he going to do about it? The truth came to Sam in pieces, like a puzzle scattered by the wind and slowly reassembled by patient hands. It started with a conversation he wasn't supposed to hear, 3 words spoken in the church vestry after Sunday service. Sam had stayed late to fix a loose board in the altar rail, work that required silence and concentration, which made him effectively invisible to people who'd forgotten the quiet man kneeling in the shadows. That's when Mayor Davidson and Marcus Webb entered the vestry, their voices low but urgent. "The survey's complete," Davidson was saying. "The mineral rights to the entire northern section belong to whoever holds the deed to the Carter Spring land." "And the brother doesn't know?" Webb's voice carried a tension Sam had never heard before. "No reason he should. The old man never registered the mineral survey, probably never even knew about it. Far as anyone knows, it's just grazing land. Keep it that way. The last thing we need is another Carter getting curious about family business." Sam's hand stilled on the hammer. Mineral rights. That changed everything. This wasn't just about water and grazing land, there was something valuable buried beneath the earth his family owned, something worth killing for. He waited until the men left, then slipped out of the church unseen. But their conversation had given him a new direction to search, and Sam was nothing if not thorough. That night, he broke into the town clerk's office. It wasn't difficult, the lock was old, and Sam had learned a few unconventional skills during his years of odd jobs around town. He spent 3 hours going through filing cabinets by lamplight, looking for any documents related to his family's land. What he found made his blood run cold. There were mineral surveys dating back 15 years, showing significant silver deposits beneath the northern section of the valley. There were correspondence files between Webb and mining companies in Denver. There were contracts for equipment, labor agreements, and shipping manifests, all related to a mining operation that didn't officially exist. And there was a letter, dated just 2 weeks before Jake's death, from the Territorial Land Office. Someone had filed a claim dispute over the Carter property, challenging the validity of their father's original deed. The dispute was set to be heard in territorial court next month. The signature on the filing was Marcus Webb's. But the most damning evidence was tucked inside a folder marked Private Correspondence. It was a letter from Webb to a business partner in Denver, written just 3 days after Jake's death. The younger Carter brother has been eliminated as a problem. The older one poses no threat, he's simple-minded and never speaks. The land dispute should proceed without interference now. We'll have clear title to the mineral rights within 60 days, and mining operations can begin immediately after the court ruling. Sam read the letter 3 times, the words burning themselves into his memory. Eliminated as a problem. They hadn't just killed Jake, they dismissed Sam as irrelevant, too simple to understand what was happening, too quiet to pose a threat. They were about to learn how wrong they were. But as Sam prepared to leave the office, he heard voices outside. Boots' steps on the wooden sidewalk, moving toward the building. He quickly extinguished his lamp and pressed himself against the wall, listening. "Thought I saw a light in here," Deputy Collins was saying. "Check it out," Webb's voice replied. "If someone's been going through those files." The front door rattled as someone tested the lock. Sam moved silently toward the back exit, but froze when he heard Webb speak again. "Collins, we may have a problem. If Sam Carter's smarter than we thought." "He's not," Collins replied with confidence that made Sam's stomach turn. "I've known Sam for years. He's barely spoke 10 words to me in all that time. Simple as they come. Simple men can be dangerous when they're cornered. Keep an eye on him. If he starts asking questions, starts poking around where he shouldn't." "I understand," Collins said quietly. Sam slipped out the back door and into the night, carrying with him the knowledge that would change everything. His brother's death wasn't random violence or a gambling dispute gone wrong. It was murder, planned and executed by men who saw the Carter brothers as obstacles to wealth and power. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated the power of a quiet man's patience, and the terrible justice that could come from silence finally broken. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of brilliant sunshine that made the desert look like God's own cathedral, all golden light and painted stone. The church bell called the people of Cedar Valley to worship, as it had for 20 years, and they came as they always did, dressed in their finest clothes, carrying their private sins and public virtues in equal measure. Sam Carter arrived early, taking his usual seat in the back pew where he could see everything and be seen by no one. But today was different. Today, he carried with him a leather saddlebag containing documents, letters, and evidence that would tear Cedar Valley apart like a tornado through a house of cards. Marcus Webb entered with his usual confidence, nodding to the townspeople, shaking hands with Mayor Davidson, playing the role of the successful businessman who'd earned his place through hard work and fair dealing. Deputy Collins followed close behind, his badge polished bright, his gun sitting easy on his hip. They had no idea that justice was sitting 20 feet away, patient as death itself. Reverend Murphy, no relation to the saloon owner, began the service with a prayer for the departed, specifically mentioning Jake Carter and asking God to comfort those left behind. Sam listened to the familiar words, feeling the weight of his brother's memory settle around him like a heavy coat. When the time came for testimonials, the weekly tradition where townspeople could share their thoughts, concerns, or celebrations, Sam stood up. The church fell silent. In 5 years of Sunday services, Sam Carter had never spoken a word during testimonials. Hell, most people had never heard him speak at all except to say yes or no when directly asked a question. He walked to the front of the church, his boots echoing on the wooden floor, and turned to face the congregation. His eyes found Marcus Webb's face, saw the flicker of concern there, the quick calculation of potential problems. "My name is Samuel Carter," he began, his voice rusty from disuse but clear as a bell. "Most of you know me as the quiet brother, the simple one who never had much to say. You figured I was too dumb to understand the world around me, too peaceful to cause trouble for anybody." He paused, letting his words sink in, watching faces throughout the congregation. Some people looked curious, others concerned. Webb's face had gone pale. "My brother Jake died 2 weeks ago." Deputy Collins ruled it an accident, said Jake fell while drunk, hit his head on a rock. Case closed, no questions asked. Sam's eyes found Collins in the crowd. But Jake wasn't drunk that night. He was scared. He discovered something that certain people didn't want him to know. Sam opened his saddlebag and pulled out the mineral survey documents. "This is a geological report showing significant silver deposits beneath land that belongs to the Carter family. Land that my father won in a poker game 20 years ago, land that certain people have been using without permission, mining without consent, stealing from while they thought nobody was watching." The congregation stirred, whispers rippling through the pews like wind through grass. Jake found out about the mining operation. He confronted the men responsible, thinking he could negotiate, thinking they were reasonable people who'd do right when faced with the truth. Sam's voice hardened. Instead, they killed him. Made it look like an accident. Figured the surviving brother was too stupid to figure out what really happened. He pulled up Webb's letter to his business partner, the one discussing Jake's elimination. "This is a letter written by Marcus Webb 3 days after my brother's death, telling his business partners that the problem had been solved." Webb stood up abruptly. "This is ridiculous. Sam, I understand you're grieving, but these wild accusations—" "Sit down, Marcus." Sam's voice cut through the church like a blade. "I'm not finished." The authority in his tone was so unexpected, so commanding, that Webb actually obeyed, sinking back into his pew. Deputy Collins has been helping cover up the murder, filing false reports, intimidating witnesses who might ask inconvenient questions. Sam's gaze swept the congregation. In fact, half the people in this room have known for months that something wasn't right. You've seen the extra cattle, the mining equipment, the strangers coming and going. But you stayed quiet because it was easier than asking hard questions. He folded the documents carefully, placed them back in the saddlebag. "My brother died because he tried to do the right thing alone. I won't make that mistake. The church door opened, and 3 men in federal marshals' badges walked in. Sam had sent his evidence to the territorial capital a week ago, along with a detailed letter explaining everything he discovered. Unlike the local law, federal marshals couldn't be bought by wealthy ranchers. Marcus Webb, the lead marshal, called out, "You're under arrest for murder, theft of mineral rights, and conspiracy to defraud the territorial government." As the marshals led Webb away in chains, Sam looked out at the stunned congregation. "Silence can be a weapon," he said quietly. "But sometimes, the most powerful thing a quiet man can do is speak up." 6 months later, Sam Carter still lived on his small ranch outside Cedar Valley, but everything had changed. The silver mine on his property was being developed by a legitimate company that paid fair wages and followed territorial law. The money from the mineral rights had made him wealthy, though he lived much the same as before. He spoke more now, not much, but enough. Enough to say good morning to his neighbors, enough to answer direct questions, enough to ensure that justice had a voice when it needed one. Jake's killer was serving life in territorial prison. Deputy Collins had been stripped of his badge and run out of town. Mayor Davidson had resigned in disgrace. Cedar Valley was learning to function without the corruption that had poisoned it for so long. But the most important change wasn't in the town or the money or the justice served. It was in Sam himself. He'd learned that silence could be powerful, but it could also be dangerous when it allowed evil to flourish unchallenged. Sometimes the quietest person in the room has the most important thing to say. So here's the question for you: when you see injustice happening around you, do you speak up, or do you stay quiet and hope someone else will handle it? Jake Carter died because he tried to fight alone. Sam Carter succeeded because he knew when silence served justice and when justice demanded a voice. What would you have done in Sam's place? Would you have stayed quiet to protect yourself, or would you have found the courage to speak truth to power, even when the cost might be everything you hold dear? The world is full of Marcus Webbs, people who use others' silence as permission to do harm. But it's also full of Sam Carters, quiet people who see everything, remember everything, and choose their moments to act. The question isn't whether you're the loud one or the quiet one in your family, your workplace, your community. The question is, when your moment comes, when justice needs a voice and you're the only one who can provide it, will you have the courage to speak? That was another story here from Dark Country Tales. If this story of justice and courage moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear about the power of standing up for what's right. Because sometimes, the quietest voice in the room carries the most powerful message of all. The next tale is already waiting in the shadows, and trust me, you won't want to miss it.